I am not an economist, so you won't need a bunch of slides with numbers on them. So Jay covered that quite well. As I mentioned, I work for one of the large irrigation districts here in the valley. I like to start my presentations with this statement. Water from the North Platte River that is diverted for irrigation drives our local economy and sustains our domestic, municipal, industrial, recreation, and fish and wildlife water uses. And I'll start with the water that's diverted that drives our economy. As you talked about the amount of precip we have here, when you look at an average of 15 inches, crop production, as Jay mentioned, is pretty limited. So without water, irrigation water, we don't have crop production. And I think as our presentations go on this morning, you'll see how the second half of that statement fits as well. Surface water in the valley is managed by the Department of Natural Resources, just like it is anywhere in the state. First in time, first in right with prior appropriation doctrine. But there are some differences how this area differs from the rest of the state. The water is stored by the Bureau under federal contracts. That's not unique to this area. Many areas of the state have federal reclamation projects in the loops in the Republican. But how it's different is that our reservoirs, our storage water is in Wyoming. So we deal with Wyoming water law as well as Nebraska water law. Our canal and one other canal actually diverts in Wyoming, so we have to deal with Wyoming statutes as well. We also have a Supreme Court decree that governs water use here in the valley, and I'll let the attorneys talk about that, but that's something that also is unique. So where does water come from? The North Platte River is a snow melt fed reservoir, or not reservoir, but system, and so the water that accumulates in the mountains of central Colorado and northern or southern Wyoming mountains is what feeds that snowmelt. And as snowmelt comes off, historically, as you can imagine, in May and June when temperatures warmed up, the snowmelt came off and the water came rushing down the river. So that was what was available early on as far as irrigation. This is a map of the basin. It starts in Colorado. It starts to form near Walden, Colorado, where several rivers and tributaries come together. Flows north into Wyoming towards the city of Casper and turns east then in Nebraska. But all along the way, there are several tributaries that contribute to the flow of that river. Early history, irrigation began in the late 1880s here. 19 water rights were granted before 1900, about 150,000 acres were part of that. The oldest water right is for the Farmers Irrigation Canal here in the Panhandle in 1887. As you can imagine, irrigation developed close to the river because it was easy to irrigate those lands, get the water diverted out into a canal system and get water to those lands. Crops were very limited. As I mentioned, it was a snowmelt fed system, so the water came rushing out of the mountains down the river and was available mostly early. So a lot, as Jay mentioned, you had small grains, you had alfalfa, things like that could be irrigated early with a reliable water supply early, and then later on in July, August, there was not a supply to grow other crops. This map kind of shows those systems that were in place prior to 1900. The light blue, I don't know how well you can see it, but those are the canal systems that existed at that time prior to future development. Things changed considerably when Congress passed the Reclamation Act in 1902. The North Platte Project, which is what this project is, was authorized, one of the first three projects authorized in 1903. Construction began in 1905 on the project, included 2 mainstream reservoirs, which are in Wyoming, 4 off-stream reservoirs, which if you're on the tour tomorrow you visit, which are Lake Manager, Lake Alice, Granite Creek, and Little Lake Alice. and about 2,000 miles of canals, laterals, and distribution system. This is what was added in 1905 with the construction of the federal project. The red line is the interstate division of the project, running on the north side of the river. Includes those inland lakes. That was constructed between 1905 and 1915. Then on the south side of the river in orange is the Fort Laramie division, which was constructed between 1915 and 1926. The yellow line is the Northport division, which was added to the end of the Farmers Irrigation Canal towards the end of the 1920s. So that was the addition that was brought into the valley with the federal project. As far as storage reservoirs, Pathfinder is the main source of storage water for the valley. Holds a little over 1 million acre foot, 1,070,000 acre foot, so it's a fairly large facility. And it's our main source of supply. It has a 1904 priority date, and is the most senior water right in Wyoming on the North Platte River for storage. Guernsey was completed in 1927. It's a smaller reservoir. It's the lowest reservoir on the system. Stores about 46,000 acre foot. Not a significant storage component. But what that gave the Bureau was the ability to re-regulate the river from Casper down. Because prior to the construction of Guernsey, all the water had to come from Pathfinder and travel 150 miles before it was diverted. So in that time frame, if you get rain or anything that could affect that flow, and basically you couldn't re-regulate the water. So at this point is an opportunity to re-regulate that water flow coming down the river. So there's a total capacity of almost 1.2 million acre foot for the North Platte project. It provides supplemental storage water to 13 districts, both in Wyoming and Nebraska, and about 325,000 acres receive storage water from the North Platte project. Glendo is another source of storage water for the valley. It was the last facility built on the North Platte. Carries a 1954 water right. It's managed for flood space as well. Has a significant storage component though at 454,000. It was completed in '58. It's the only multi-purpose project on the system. Everything other than that was authorized for irrigation and power generation. But this one added flood control, fish and wildlife benefits, and recreation. It provides storage water to about 8 districts and about another 36,000 acres. So if you look at the valley tolls, there are 26 irrigation districts and canal companies between the Nebraska-Wyoming state line and Lake McConaughey. And there's approximately about 300,000 acres served in that reach, about 2,000 water view. Drink. As far as benefits, I like to use this photo. If you can't read the sign, it says, "Have faith in God and U.S. Reclamation." And so you can see what the valley probably looked like prior to development by reclamation. But basically, the stored water provided us a late season water supply, and it would allow us to move from small grains, grass, alfalfa irrigation into the crops we grow today, the sugar beets, the dry beans, the corn. It added a significant value to the valley. And as you can see, dry land versus dry land, when you only get 14 inches, 15 inches of precipitation, dry land cropping is even pretty limited. So it made a significant difference as far as the economy of the valley. As far as other benefits, on the federal facilities, there are 6 hydroelectric plants that produce clean, renewable energy. As far as wildlife benefits, the project created significant wetland areas, as well as there are national wildlife refuges established on Pathfinder Reservoir as well as in the lake, so it provides significant wildlife benefits. And of course, recreation is a big item anymore. All the federal reservoirs in Wyoming, other than Cordes Dam Reservoir, have recreational opportunity, as well as the inland lakes, which in our area is a significant water recreation value. I'm going to talk a little bit about the groundwater benefits, and I know John will hit on this pretty hard, but this is basically just a diagram showing a slice of the valley with the canals and stuff. And basically all these canals are earthen canals. There are very little sections that are lined. So as a result, they all leak. And that leakage through time, as the water was applied out to the edges of the valley, everything grew out from the river as development occurred. And so water that was normally rushing down the river in May, June, was now being diverted and put out into these canals for irrigation in the later months. And as a result, that seepage that come out of those canals would go down in the sand and gravel formations and started to create the aquifers we have today, particularly on the north side where we have more sand and gravel formation. And so as a result, most groundwater recharge in the valley comes from these canal systems. That's what supplies it. But as these aquifers began to rise with the water that was going into them from the canals, a lot of the dry gulches started to run water. As that water level came up, it started to come in contact with those tributaries, and this is just a few of the tributaries that now flow water back to the river. And as a result, it's created a system of use and reuse here in the valley. This next slide is a diagram that's pretty busy, but I try to demonstrate how the system works. All the reds are the canals, the 26 irrigation canals that either divert in Wyoming and all the way down to McConaughey. The green lines are the drains and tributaries that bring water back out of that diversion to the river. And as you can see, a lot of those tributaries come back right before the next diversion. So it's a good opportunity for those canals to have a water supply. If it wasn't for that return flow, there would be no water supply for those canals. And it was actually recognized in the Nebraska v. Wyoming litigation that the court didn't address water uses below the state line because it was envisioned that that return flow would be the supply for those uses. Water, as far as concerns for surface water, probably one of the biggest concerns we're facing is water supply at times. Is climate change affecting that in our watershed? I think it has had some effect. Historically, about one year out of every 10 or 12 years, we'd have a water supply shortage. Since 2002, about the last 20 years, we've had 8. So the frequency of our water shortages is increasing. And our allocation years, this year is an allocated year actually. We have a fairly decent supply this year, but the supplies has been as little as 50% of what normal would be in the past. So water supply is a big item to surface water districts as far as what's been changing. Just briefly mention the Platte River Recovery Program. Because of our federal projects and our federal contracts, we have direct exposure to endangered species. Section 7 consultation under the Act exposes our water uses. It exposes the Bureau of Reclamation to review and mitigate and offset the impacts of our project on the species in Central Platte. And as a result, the irrigation districts in the valley have been very supportive of the Platte program. We think it's a very reasonable approach to address the concerns. It's been very successful, quite frankly. And it's a lot better alternative than going through litigation and battles with Fish and Wildlife Service. Probably a big item, and Jay touched on it briefly, is aging water infrastructure. I don't know if you can read these dates, but these are some of the structures on my system, date back to 1908. The one at 1915 is actually Outlet Works at Lake Minnetonka, where the tour will visit tomorrow at 1915. But 1906, it gives you an idea of the size of these structures. That's Spring Canyon flume. It's about 250 foot long concrete flume. It's about 40 foot wide, 12 foot high, 2 foot concrete sides and bottom, and it's all supported by that arch substructure. I couldn't imagine what the cost of replacing that structure would be, but it would be several $1 million to replace. We continue to do a lot of maintenance on our systems, trying to keep them in good repair, but you know, it's a battle we have. But it's also on the federal side. This is the North Spillway Gate at Guernsey, which was rehabbed in 2016. It's 50 foot wide, 50 foot high. It's about 2 foot thick steel gate. Sets kind of in the corner of the dam where you can see it in the lower picture. That facility was rehabbed in 2016. The cost was about $5.7 million. My district share alone is over $1 million. So there's a significant cost, not only of maintaining what we operate, but what the Bureau operates as well. Then you have the disaster. This is the tunnel collapse on the Fort Laramie Canal in 2019. Basically washed out the canal and stopped irrigation delivery in mid-July to over 100,000 acres in Wyoming and Nebraska. They've been continuing to make repairs, temporary repairs, trying to put this canal or this tunnel back in service. They had some water back in the system in 2019, and last year in 2020 they were limited to about a 75% delivery, which had a huge impact on their crop production under that district. This year I think they did some modifications this past winter to improve the flow through the canal, or through the tunnel, and they're now probably delivering closer to 80–85%, I believe. But they have to come up with a final repair, and the cost could be millions of dollars to put this tunnel back in service. I mentioned that LR 117, the surface water districts in the state have been working to address aging surface infrastructure. And LR 117 is an interim study in the legislature to take a look at the extent of surface water irrigation in the state, look at the facilities that are used for that irrigation, and condition and what the future costs could be. I think what we have to look at is some way to develop funding partners. It can't all fall just on the irrigators. They can't afford to replace or repair tunnels that cost $20 million. They just can't do it on their own. So I think we're looking to the legislature to see if there could be some sources, some additional funding to help with that. We have worked with Mark Platte R&D on projects. We have some things that are limited in what we can do. I know there's been some surface water leases, but when you deal with storage water, on that side, that's a federal water right. We're somewhat limited on what we can do. Also, there's been some groundwater recharge cooperation between the canals to improve recharge, to help with the water supply and address the issues that NRD has to deal with. And there again, we have some hindering things as far as what we can do. Like my project is part of the federal project. It's authorized for irrigation, so it's not authorized for groundwater recharge. So as a result, it kind of hinders what we can do as far as participation. But some of the canals that are not part of the federal project have been able to participate and work with NRD. And I think with that, I'll just end. These are just photos of Pathfinder Dam in good times when things are spilling. I would mention this year we are under water short allocation. We have a fairly good supply, and most of the districts are going to be able to get our irrigators to the end of the season, but most likely we're going to have virtually no carryover for next year. Thank you.
I think we'll have John go next, and we'll save questions for the end.
the record to show that Dennis showed me how to advance the slides. So that's our cooperation, since federal rules prevent anything else. So what I'm going to do with my slideshow today is, Jesse asked me to touch on 2 or 3 different very important aspects of the way that we operate out here, but I also wanted to give just kind of a general overview of what we do. You're going to probably see a lot of review of what Dennis just talked about, and I apologize about that. We probably say it a bit differently, but we're saying the same sort of thing. So I named my presentation An Unlikely Place, because if you looked at our place, our area here on paper, you would say it's not a particularly great place for agriculture. But some of what Dennis just talked about has kind of turned it into the Garden of Eden that we enjoy. This is a very wordy slide, but it sort of goes to Dennis's point about the North Platte project. When it was established back in 1903 as part of the Federal Reclamation Act, it created this system that we have come to enjoy here today, not just in terms of surface water irrigation, but with those surface water canals leaking and creating all of those tributaries that we also enjoy. We have created this system that recharges our shallow aquifers in this area. And you'll note that that's a very similar picture to the one that he showed at Burnsley. We probably should have coordinated and just done a sort of Abbott and Costello routine. So geography and hydrology, those of you that are from anywhere east of here, think of Nebraska kind of as this deep Ogallala aquifer formations where you have 1,000 feet of saturated thickness of water, and you can basically irrigate to your heart's content. That is not the way that we operate out here. As Dennis mentioned, and as I will tell you, that we are very heavily dependent on snowmelt and snowpack in the northern Colorado and southern Wyoming mountains, and therefore all of our recharge into this shallow alluvial system is based on what is falling in the wintertime and the spring snows that we have. That is being impacted by climate. We have significantly quicker snow melts. We have much less tree cover in those mountain systems, so that when we start to see the spring melt, it runs off quickly, and if there's not storage available for it, it runs on by. And I should mention as well, somebody was talking about the value, Jay during this conversation was talking about the value of water, and I would just build upon, I think, what Jessica and Jay and others were talking about. Without that recharge of those shallow systems, you would be hard-pressed to provide municipal water supply for all of the municipalities in our district. Talking a little bit about the irrigation efficiency, I know this was covered a little bit earlier, but we've had different iterations of irrigation efficiency changes. Jessica mentioned that she is still setting the siphon tubes, and all of us we all set siphon tubes 25 years ago. Now there's a lot less of that. We went from sort of a siphon tube in a dirt ditch to a siphon tube in a concrete ditch to a gated pipe to a pivot system, and now we've got a lot of variable rate irrigation that is starting to find its way into the system as well. Each of those iterations has changed the efficiency, which has impeded the runoff and the sort of slop in the system that we use for those return flows to get back to the river into the tributaries. We mentioned a little bit about this earlier on, but this is kind of the major crop types in the Panhandle. For those of you that are not from here, some of these won't even look all that familiar to you. We are routinely in the top 1 or 2 states, top 1 or 2 regions in terms of dry bean production, sugar beet production. We grow potatoes here. We're going to see a potato facility tomorrow on the tour. We grow a lot of small grains and obviously a great deal of hay. I want to talk a little bit about the way we govern at least groundwater in Nebraska. I think probably most of you are familiar with this, but maybe some of you are not. We have a unique system of conservation districts in Nebraska. Every state has a conservation district, but in most states they are run by state government. Here, 52 years ago, this system was established to be directed by a locally elected board of directors. We're a political subdivision that was established by the state. So we are a taxing authority, but we are governed by a local board, not unlike a school board. And because of that, we think that we can approach more unique issues to that area because of that locally elected board. So we may approach something a great deal differently than Twin Platte does or than Upper Big Blue does, because those entities have unique issues as well that they're trying to address in their own way. We're better at it than they are, but you know. So just to give you an impression of the kind of area that we cover geographically, we're about 3.5 million acres of land. We cover what I sort of describe as 4 1/3 counties. The third is this part of Sioux up here, the very southern part of Sioux. We only have 45,000 people in our district, so it's relatively small in terms of total population. Those are 14 different towns and villages. Land use is primarily range, but we've also got 33% of crop and pasture, and then lakes, wetlands, and forests, believe it or not, make up about 4% of our land uses. LB 962, if you don't know what that is, you probably shouldn't be here, but I'll quickly tell you, LB 962 was a law that was passed in 2004 that essentially required the state to determine different fully appropriated and over-appropriated basins throughout the state. Ours was one of those that was designated as fully appropriated. There's going to be a slide here in just a moment with a map on that. But essentially what that requires is it requires us to go through a planning process in 10-year increments to come back to a fully appropriated status and also a post-1997 level of development. Essentially what it means is we had overdeveloped our groundwater to the point where we needed to start to scale back and become a bit more efficient. This is the map that I was talking about. You see the North Platte River Valley. All of this pink is the over-appropriated area in the valley, and then this darker pink is the over-appropriated area in Pumpkin Creek. We're going to be seeing a lot of that during the tour in the next couple of days. For that, in order to address those issues, we go through an integrated management planning process. We are in partnership with the Department of Natural Resources. There's some representatives here today, Jim Oster. We work with them and all of our stakeholders in the area. We have a number of different stakeholders we work with in order to come up with a plan in order to meet certain goals. In the first iteration of our INP planning process about 13 years ago, our obligations were returning 8,000 acre-feet of water back to the river in perpetuity, and then also coming to that post-1997 level of development. Over the course of that time, through a variety of different measures, we were able to meet both of those obligations. We were one of only 2 NRDs in the Upper Platte that was able to do that. Now during our second iteration, we also are charged with maintaining that level of development that we went through in that first iteration, and also developing a basin-wide drought plan, which we're currently working on with the department. I'm going to touch only briefly on this because our crackpot hydrologist is going to be speaking a little bit later today. Those of you that met him last night know what I'm talking about. Western Water Use Management Model. We do a very unique system of modeling that here based solely on data. We collect a whole bunch of data and we use it. So all of our irrigation flow meters, all of our irrigation wells are metered. So we know every drop that is pumped for various different purposes. We also meter municipalities. We also meter other uses. We know all of our where all of our domestic wells are. We measure water levels and contaminants in a monitoring well network of about 800 monitoring wells across the district. We collect a tremendous amount of data. We also collect a whole bunch of data on weather. We have, I think it's 8, but Scott will correct me if I'm wrong. He's saying way more than that. No, it's not. But we have a wide number of weather stations across the district where we collect information on precipitation, wind speed and direction. We also collect information on soil moisture, etc. All of that is put into this model so that we can make some determinations about a few different things. One is the net irrigation requirements, so we know what the impacts of our allocation are, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The second, that's very important. The second, which is even more important, is determining what the impacts would be if a given well was shut off for a period of time, or a given acre of land was not irrigated for a period of time. because that happens both in the natural scheme of things, and then it's also incentive to happen from time to time. CRP is a way that it's incentive to happen. We have programs where it's incentive to happen. Or somebody mentioned, I think it was Jessica, about the odd-shaped fields that we have. Some of these fields are just a pain in the butt to try to farm. So those lands go fallow, and we need to realize what's happening when those acres aren't irrigated in a given period of time. When we talk about water planning and how we deal with the INP obligations, our district, we're pretty proud of the fact that we have a pretty equal balance of both regulation and incentive programs to help producers be a partner in meeting some of our obligations. These are some of the regulations that we've gone through. We've got a moratorium on well drilling. There will not be another irrigation well that is drilled in this district except for the cases where it is a replacement well for one that has failed. We have a moratorium on acre development. We have certification of all groundwater uses. We have a metering of all of our irrigation wells, both those that are regulated and those that aren't. So that means that even if you are not regulated, we're still collecting data on your water use. We also have a deficit level of allocation for groundwater users, and that is 70 inches here in the North Platte River Valley, and it is 60 inches in the Pumpkin Creek Basin over a period of 5 years. People will ask, well, what's the difference? There's not a whole lot of difference in terms of climate or geography or whatever. I will tell you, probably at the risk of finding myself in a bit of trouble, that I think that was a purely political decision. Pumpkin Creek was sort of the epicenter of water wars very early on in this whole process, and I think they wanted to make that a little bit bigger deficit level for irrigation. So I think that's probably the difference. And the reason it's over a period of 5 years, just to quickly touch on that, we, as Dennis pointed out, have a great deal of drought in this area, historic cyclical drought. And because of that, our board wanted to build in an opportunity for you to use carry forward irrigation in times that are heavy precipitation so that you could use those resources a little bit later on when you might have a drought situation. We've got a whole bunch of incentives. Our board has been very sensitive to the fact that we needed to be a partner with our landowners as we were trying to meet some of these obligations under the integrated management plan, so we've done a number of different things. Retirements and temporary leases are kind of easy stuff. This is the stuff where you can identify some pieces of ground that maybe are marginal, maybe not as good, maybe are routinely fallow, and we would like to see those come out of production so that you can focus your efforts and resources on some of those areas that might be more advantageous to the economy. So we've done some of those, but not as many of late, and I think that's sort of waning over time. Surface water intentional recharge. We have a terrific project out here that we are desperately waiting for Jim's colleagues at the department to approve the permits for. This is a project where we have at least 5, and are going to add 2 additional farms on the Enterprise Irrigation Canal to take that water that would normally be diverted for irrigation, put it into an intentional recharge pit for intentional recharge in order to sustain the aquifer. We would then take credit for those inches that were not consumptively used by the crop. If we can prove this up, that this is a viable thing, and it's certainly been a viable thing in certain parts of central Nebraska, this could really be a good way for us to take some of that surface water in times of good flows and store that for times when we might need it into the future. Encouraging producer innovation through conservation, which is our EPIC program. That is a program that has 2 components. One is a bonus payment for those people that want to re-sign into a federal program. If you're an EQIP or CRP or PREP or something like that, and you're trying to determine how can I make this work to sign up for another iteration of that. That's a bonus payment, a one-time payment of $50 an acre. We also do an allocation buy-down. So for instance, if Steve Smith wants to try to raise corn on 10 inches per acre rather than 14 inches per acre, he's going to sort of make a bet in his own mind that he can do that, and we will buy back those additional 4 inches so we can use that for credit with our obligations. That's been an incredibly popular program and has been very beneficial for us as we work toward our obligations. Cost share, we do a bunch of cost share. We do it in partnership with the state through the Nebraska Soil and Water Conservation Program, also through the Water Quality Fund program, which is primarily funded through fertilizer surcharge. But then we also do it with our own funds as well, both funds that are funded through grant dollars or funds that we generate through property tax. And these are some of the things that we fund in order to help people sort of become more on-farm efficient. Through pivot packages, moisture probes, drop nozzles, VRA technology, etc. We also have a telemetry program, so we can collect information more real-time than we do normally. That program has had fits and starts. I think we're finally back to a starting point. But that was a grant-funded project, both through the Department of Natural Resources and the Nebraska Environmental Trust. And we now have about 860 of our meters where we can collect that information remotely rather than sending a human being out to look at our meters. Alternative cropping program, I only put this on here because it's something I want to do again in the future. We did this once. We were trying to pilot a project where we were looking at maybe getting people to look at alternative crops rather than high water use crop. We were trying to look at maybe converting about 1,000 acres of corn to sunflowers. We did that right when corn went up to about $5.50 a bushel. You know how successful the program that was. So maybe at some point in the future, we're just not sure. TAP H2 I have listed here. We've partnered with an organization out of Denver that is also sort of a remote sensing individual reporting program for meter reads. Again, I put that up there because it just shows some of the things that we're trying out to see what might be effective. I'm not going to go through all of these because this kind of goes through what I was just talking about with each of the individual items. But I will tell you the biggest con for permanent retirements of irrigation is it's pretty expensive and it can be impactful of the tax base. Surface water intentional recharge. This is a picture of our pit. Again, Jim, that we want to have filled with water at some point when your colleagues get it together. This is just to the west of Scotts Bluff over on Spring Creek Road. It's about 15 acres, thereabouts, of space that we're going to fill with water from these 4 or 5 different pieces of land, and we think that it's going to be just a tremendous demonstration of that program. Again, this is the EPIC, I should have went through these as I was explaining them. This is the EPIC program. We pay $15 an acre inch on those acres that you might want to, acre inches that you might want to sell back to us. It's a way for the farmer to hedge their potential losses or potential profits, and it's also a way for us to earn back a little bit more allocation credit. Bonus program, cost share program, telemetry, boy, I've gone through all this. Drought mitigation planning. I think we were the second NRD in the state to go through a drought mitigation planning process. It was about a 2-year process. Tracy Zayak, who was somewhere in here, used to work for us, and he sort of spearheaded this effort. So if you have bigger questions than I can answer, she's the one to talk to. But we worked with the National Drought Mitigation Center as a facilitator on this, and our effort was in order to ensure that we weren't doing drought planning in the middle of a drought. We really came up with 3 or 4 different outcomes, but this simply doesn't go far enough. I think our stakeholders would admit that. I think I would admit that. I think Tracy would stand from the mountaintop and scream it. We don't have triggers built into our drought mitigation plan, and that is something that we're probably going to be focusing on in the future. When you look at Dennis's slide that says 42% of the last 20 years have been water short years, this is something that we have to realize that there is an inevitability about that we need to plan for. But we are proud of the fact that we've gone through at least an education process and we're doing a lot of outreach on drought, but we need to step that up a little bit and see if there are ways that we might be able to either incent or encourage different behaviors in times of dryness. Climate adaptation, I put this in here because I think it's important for us to note not only the dryness scale, but also the hotness scale. And the things that we may be facing in the future as a surface water dependent district. So this points out, our work with the telemetry, our work with Mesonet on hosting weather collection data, also our 6 different NOAA-style weather stations that we collect data on. And those are all important pieces, important data points to use as we focus our efforts on how we might mitigate or adapt to a changing climate. Next steps, this is some of the things that we're thinking about in the future. So there's been a lot of talk about cover crops in the media of late in terms of carbon capture. We would like to use them for a whole bunch of different stuff. I'm going to get to a slide in a moment on nutrient management, but we've seen cover crops as a way to help mitigate nutrient management, mitigate leaching. But we also see it as a carbon capture potential, also a moisture holding potential in the soil. So a lot of different things we could be doing with cover crops. So that's something that we're building into our plans in the future to promote cover cropping and perhaps leverage some of those federal incentive dollars that may be coming down the pipe. Research projects, I put this in here as a thank you to the University of Nebraska and others that we work with in terms of research. Ankit is somewhere, there he is. Ankit with the Water for Food Institute has worked with us a great deal on our nutrient management outreach process, and I was just talking to him in the hallway to maybe do some more with that. Worked with Shin, who's somewhere, Shin Chow, and also Bajesh Maharjan on a couple of different variable rate projects here. We're working with Jess Corman, who is on the agenda for later. There she is on StreamNet, which was sort of foiled by COVID last year, but we hope to unfoil it this year. I just point this out because we can't do what we do without a whole lot of partnership and assistance from folks like you. That's why we applied you with beer and barbecue last night. Nutrient management, this has been like a very, very big priority for our board in the past year and a half. We have a growing nitrate problem here, much the same as some of you have already realized in the eastern parts of the state. We want to get ahead of it before it gets ahead of us. And so we have gone through a process now of passing a rule that we're working on an implementation plan on, but also establishing some baselines that we'll talk about just a little bit. I think all of you know this slide, but this is essentially what happened when you're talking about commercial fertilizer or manure for crop management. We apply too much, the crop doesn't uptake it, and then we've got a problem in our groundwater. One of the things that we intended to do in order to avoid some of the pitfalls that some of our colleagues across the state have found in dealing with nutrient management is working with stakeholders, and we engaged them very early on. We appointed an advisory board that was made up of a whole bunch of different people that are both directly and indirectly engaged in nutrient management, and I think that has helped us shape a better rule. We're doing a great deal of outreach on this project, and it may be slow going, probably too slow from our perspective, but we want to do it right so that we don't meet a whole lot of resistance at the end of the day. Our advisory committee was made up of retailers, wholesalers, users, municipalities that were dealing with water quality concerns, domestic well users, etc. There you go. Also, advocacy groups, both agriculture advocacy and then maybe health advocacy groups as well. Nutrient management rule. What we wanted to ensure that what we did was to adopt a phased approach to nutrient management designed to limit leaching, save input costs for producers, and save future expenses for managers of drinking water systems. Essentially, we wanted to avoid what we faced in the early 2000s in the Panhandle when we were dealing with water regulatory standards for arsenic and uranium here, and ended up spending about $75 million from the Wyoming state line to Llewellyn and all of these little tiny communities in order to meet those regulatory requirements. We also wanted to ensure that people understood that there was a credit of nitrate in their systems. Right? You know, in some cases we had a credit of up to 100 or 150 pounds of nitrogen in well water that was being used to irrigate crops that we were also spraying commercial fertilizer on. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're living within our regulatory requirements limiting that leaching. Right now we're in the midst of this 2-year baseline study, and the reason that we're doing that isn't because we don't have a bunch of data. We do. We have about 40 years worth of data in some cases. But we want to make sure the data is consistently collected. When you're dealing with something that could be impactful of people's livelihoods, we want to make sure that we're doing it right. So we're taking kind of a breather in establishing this 2-year baseline before we establish any areas of concern or phase regulation. Jesse asked me to put this slide in here. I know that this is sort of a tenuous issue for some in the room. So I'm just going to give you kind of a brief understanding of, by the way, we completely switched gears. This was a terrible segue. But there is an interbasin transfer proposal currently in front of the Department of Natural Resources that would take Platte River water and divert it through central Nebraska public power facilities down into the Republican River Basin. We have respectfully objected. We recognize why this has been proposed, but one of the things that we're concerned about, and this is a cut and paste, by the way, but one of the things that we're concerned about is in times where there's excess water in the Platte River Basin, we want to try to utilize that water for good stuff here. You know, you saw that intentional recharge facility, you've seen all of the canal structures that Dennis pointed out. In times of excess, we would like to be able to utilize diversions into those facilities and get that water stored underground. We recognize the other side does not want to. They would like to see that water go for some of our objectives in the Republican River Basin. That is currently working its way through the Department of Natural Resources, but that is why this NRD is one of the 6 or 7 objectors to that application. We are still very much friends with the applicants, so it's not a fisticuffs thing, but that's, I wanted to touch on that just briefly so that you understood our position on it. This is the last slide, so I will pipe down, but I do want to point out that there are 2 major challenges that I think we all face in water management. One is that guy who is the sort of grumpy farmer with a long history and a long culture of the way that he or she always does things, and the other is that calculator, being able to find the resources to do all the great stuff that we do. We are finding much greater acceptance with the person on the left than we are with the calculator on the right. Our farmers have been tremendous partners in doing the things that we do. They have also given us many ideas and inputs that have become programs over the course of time, so they've been just tremendous. As Senator Erdman or Val can tell you, when you're dealing with public budgets, that's a much more difficult process. So we're doing the very, very best we can. We've cut 30% of our budget over the course of the past 3 years. This year we are flat finally, but it's getting tougher. Dennis mentioned the infrastructure costs and some of the things that they face in terms of their growers as well. So I think that's going to be our biggest challenge moving forward. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Dennis and John. I always learn something in these presentations, but in a world of that talks about mandates and incentives to reach a certain goal, in the water world, what I learned today is, they set a goal of returning water back to the stream and going back in time, and they met both of those goals. That's a big deal in the water world. That's to manage those incentives and mandates correctly and get there, I think it should be celebrated. So thank you for that. And Dennis, I feel for you and all your infrastructure needs. As we age, we're not supposed to talk about how old we are, but as we age, we have all sorts of infrastructure needs. So Dennis highlighted quite a few of those. So with that, we have time for questions. So Jesse might run a mic around, and if we have questions for the group.
This question is for John. It's more of a clarification question. You talked about mandates and incentives for the area, and you mentioned there's a moratorium on acreage development. Would you be a little bit more specific on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so what we have today in terms of irrigated acres is what we will have into the future. We won't have any additional acres certified for irrigation in our district forever and ever, amen. That is not to say that there aren't acres that are developed for irrigation if they're within boundaries of surface water districts that are otherwise not irrigated. So for instance, and make sure that I say this right, Dennis. Let's say Dennis has an area of 230,000 acres, which is much more. But let's say that he's got that. And under his district, there's only 218,000 that are currently being irrigated, current users of his water. That means that there is a net amount of 12,000 acres that would be available, not for development per se, but for irrigation within those boundaries. Did I say that sort of right? No, he's going to be sad. I should have asked my attorney that. He could have clarified that. Anyway, so there will be no other acres that will be developed for irrigation on the groundwater.
John, you talked about reduction in budgets and matching funds. You talk a lot about your producer's investment, but what is the acceptance rate? I mean, what level is, I mean, are you at 10 or 20%? Are you at 30? And what would be the goals? What would make the most sense that the value of the investment of the tax dollar into making those changes or changes in behavior? So you knew this question was coming.
I wish I would have planted the question more. So I think every dollar that we invest in this kind of stuff is good. I think that we have probably a threshold that we are never going to meet, but we always should strive for of maybe 50-60% acceptance rate. You've got to keep in mind that all of the programs that I talked about in terms of incentives, or largely all of them, are cost share programs. And in a year like this year, or a year like last year, where you've seen a downturn in commodity markets, people aren't wildly enthusiastic about, or maybe just can't, come up with their 50% of the cost share. And so I think we need to recognize that there is a reality that not every farmer has a great deal of equity to spend, or has a great deal, it's not that they're not interested, it's just that they don't have the money to do it. There has been a tightening, but I wouldn't say significant tightening in terms of grant dollars. There has been, there's still a lot of funds that are available out there. The question for our board has become whether we want to prioritize those match dollars and we want to use them for something else. When I first came to the NRD, in about our third year, we made a major shift in our revenue sources. We went from about 40% grant funds to about 60% grant funds in the third year. That's a very good mix of the way revenues ought to work. We were able to keep our property taxes low-ish. We were able to keep our levy low-ish. But we were still able to do really good stuff because we were getting state and federal money. That has really evened out of late. If you look at our budget today, we're about 50%, 50 and 50. That makes me a bit nervous, because either through the marketplace or because of legislative action, we're going to see a change in the way the valuations happen in the house. And political subdivisions need to plan ahead for that eventuality so that we can still fund good stuff. But in terms of what we would like to, I would like to, you drove here, those of you that drove on the bus yesterday, you drove by pivots that are 50 years old and have 50-year-old pivot packages in them. They're very inefficient, leaky, they're not particularly good. We have very inefficient ways of the way that we are applying nitrogen to cornfields. We have, and then we have, on the flip side of that, the most state-of-the-art subsurface drip systems that are enormously efficient. Both sides of that ball have both good points and downfalls to it, and we need to ensure that each individual producer is given the opportunity to get the tools that they need for them to be successful and for us to realize the return flows that both we rely on and all of you that are downstream rely on as well.
Just a quick follow-up to that is the tools that are currently being used in your district, soil moisture probes, your weather stations, your kind of that whole process, and I know that you're looking at cover crops. If you were to pick an ideal situation of moving forward, what would be a place to reposition your NRD to be able to move that needle, to move that adoption piece? Where do you see that in the next, in the absence of money,
Yeah.
in the absence of participation, what would be a wish list?
I would like to see a sort of stair-step approach to water management, so that we could pick up some of the low-hanging fruit. Pivot packages, you can replace a pivot package on a number of these pivots for a couple $1,000. Drop nozzles, also relatively cheap. Soil and moisture probes, also relatively cheap. I mean, you're talking about maybe an investment of $8,000 or $10,000 on a given field, and you can improve the water use by 50%. If we just did that, we would be ahead of the game. I think telemetry, we may have been premature in getting that into the field. I think that there is going to be a much bigger interest in the future in that, using that big data for your own water management, certain producers notwithstanding. So I think I don't want to chase down the shining object. There's a lot of apps out there. There's a lot of different calculators you can use. But at the end of the day, it really is talking about how much water you're applying on that crop and how much water can that crop uptake and evapotranspirate and turn into a fruit. That's it. So if we're trying to figure out how we're going to better position a farmer, we need to look at their particular maybe negatives and positives on their farm. And largely in our area, it is that they haven't utilized some of those very basic efficiency gains that they could, and we cost share all of them. I mean, think about a $2,000 or $3,000 pivot package, and we cost share at 50%. It's $1,500, and you're saving a lot of water. You add to that the drop nozzles, maybe cost you another $1,500. We pay for a good portion of a moisture probe. So for $6,500 out of a producer's pocket, you're suddenly about 50% more efficient. That's pretty impressive. That's what I would like to see. I'd like to see an evaluation of each individual farm and see how it might be beneficial. Not mandating, not forcing it down your throat, but saying, look, we've got resources available to help you do this, and you could be more profitable because of it.
I'm in.
Okay. Anything else? Jesse standing up? Okay. Thank you all very much.